What's up? This is the ACM at UCLA YouTube channel. It's poppin'. It's currently 5 p.m. on a Wednesday, and I just finished work, and we're going to talk about React. It's going to be a fun time. If you're watching at home, I would strongly recommend that if you are unfamiliar with React, that you should start with the Intro to React video. Mostly because that's how introductions work, but also because today we'll be assuming that you remember most of the stuff that we talked about last time, and we're going to continue making OnlyFans our favorite website to go to. So very quickly, in the repository for this lesson, I'm going to post that in the comments. And if you're watching with me right now, you can go to the GitHub repo. I've completed this website, OnlyFans, which is a fan selling website. And this is a little different from the OnlyFans that we made last week or on Monday, because there are a few extra features that we've added. And today we're going to walk through how you can add those features and how that ties into React as a whole. At the same time, you're probably going to tell me, Matt, our Learning Labs is not going to look exactly like this OnlyFans website, and you're right. But unfortunately, there's some things that I can't fully cover without going to things like Firebase or databases or the other complex things that we haven't gone through yet. So for now, you have to bear with this OnlyFans website that we're going to be selling fans to Matt, Matthew, and Mateo. But yeah, this is what I have right now in this code on the left. So today, how this is going to work is I'm going to try to put as much of the code on one screen as possible. But I'm going to make one exception to that rule right now, which is, if you remember from last week, we created two components. So we have the app component. That's our top level, the entire app is this component. And right now it's a function because there's no state. And we also have this list of people component an array of list of people that then generates a bunch of people that we're the fan of, okay? And that second component is called fan club maker. It's a terrible name, but that's what we are stuck with. This is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But the very first thing I'm going to talk about is, okay, so I want to make it easier for people to maintain my code. Can I split this up a little bit better? And the answer is, of course you can, because this is programming. So we're going to just put all of this code into a new file called fanclubmaker.js. And in reality, you should probably make a folder structure and have a lot of good organization tactics. Because I know this is going to be a demo app, I'm not going to do that. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that. And we'll show you example apps where the structure is a little bit better. So what does that code motion look like? I'm going to move this to fan club maker. So this is basically just copy pasting at this moment. And there's one extra thing I have to do, right? So if you remember from Leo's talk about modules, in JavaScript, when we want to import or export things, we have to name them. So in this case, I'm going to do export and then default. So default means if anyone imports this file, if they don't specify what they want, we're just going to give them this thing, okay? And then we're just going to do fan club maker because that's the name of this class. Then we'll hop in over here and we're just going to import our file as normal. So we'll do import fan club maker because that's the name of the component we want from fan club maker. And in this case, this is the relative path. So we're going to refresh. Nothing has happened, but I just want to tell you this is usually the way you want to organize your files. So if you do it this way, right, you're just not going to have that many confusing things going on. Can I split screen vertically? Yes, I can. Okay, there we go. So everything on one screen, still all you need to know. But now we split it up into two different files, and this makes it easier for us to read our code. But we haven't actually learned anything yet. This is just kind of organizational stuff. Okay, cool. So if you recall from last time, we can say that you're the fan of someone, and then you become their only fan. So here's the thing, right? This button is great, but I want to be able to maybe input a number and have that display on the screen. It's more than just a button, okay? So this is going to be the first concept I'm going to talk about, and this is a little out of order of the notes, but I think this is organically makes a bit more sense of what we're doing. I'm going to talk about input control and a concept called the state as a source of truth. So if you just watched the last video, we briefly talked about state. We're like, oh, this is important in React, but I didn't really explain why it's important. And so this is one important reason why we use state. So if you remember from last time, I said the app state is the information about that component that the component itself controls. So this is not information that it gets from its parent. That would be props. So in state, in particular, if there's anything the component needs to manage, if we put all of that in the app state or the component state, then we know every time it gets updated, 100% of the time, every time. And then we can write code that updates itself based off of that state. If we have information that the app needs to like operate, but it's not in the app state, then the app's not going to update properly. And maybe you'll press the button, but the action that's supposed to happen when the button presses doesn't happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to model as much of the stuff we can in the app state. So in this case, I'm going to go to my main app. I'm going to add something above this, and we're going to say, I don't know, make like, I want to get Peter in this whole OnlyFans thing. So we're going to do, a thing here that says, hey, add a fan. Okay. So I'm going to get rid of this logo too. I'm sorry. The logo is nice, but we don't need it. So I want to be able to type something in here, maybe hit a button, and then it'll add a fan card for them. Does that make sense so far? Great. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how are we going to get the stuff from this input to our app state, okay? Is there any sort of event-based thing that Lisha may or may not have committed to Cypher Salad very recently that might help us with this design pattern? Lisha, you just submitted a pull request using this. How would we get the stuff from the input?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
So I have this input tag, right?
Yes.
I want to get the value, like when the user types in something here. I want to get what they're typing in. How would I do that?
The value attribute.
Actually,
Is that
no.
not what you're...
No, you're close. We'll come back to the value attribute in a moment.
Okay.
So the answer I'm looking for is an on change. So
yeah, okay.
In the JavaScript thing, and also we mentioned on Monday, React and JavaScript is very event-based. So what this means is that if something else happens, JavaScript will fire an event, and then it's your job to process that event. So one event for every input tag is called the onChange event. And so the onChange event fires every time the input changes. And then here, we just need to put a function. Does that make sense so far? So whatever we put in the onChange will get called by that. Cool. So I'm going to write a function. In order to do that, since we haven't learned hooks, I need to make this a class-based component, but that's not too big of a deal. I'll just do that. And if you don't remember the difference between class-based and functional, I wouldn't worry about it too much for now, but we can always discuss that if you do. So I'm going to add a function in the app that handles the event, right? So I'm going to call this, I don't know, like input handler. That seems like a good name, right? And in this case, this is an anonymous function. It's an arrow function. And I actually need the parameter here. So we haven't really talked about this, but when the event happens, JavaScript will also give you some information about the event, right? Or just be kind of useless if they were like, oh, something happened, and you're just, okay, what am I supposed to do with that? So we'll get a little bit of information. And one piece of information JavaScript will give us is information about the event. And we're just going to call that event. And we're going to use that in just a moment. So what's inside here? This is just a normal function. So for now, I'm just going to make this console.log event. So, I didn't. And then finally here, we'll add the onChange. Peter, I have a question. When I type in this .input handler, do I put the parentheses or do I not put the parentheses?
You're not putting the parentheses?
Why not?
Because you want when onChange is activated, you want the function to be called then, but you don't want it to be called on like the first look.
Peter, it's beautiful. This is what I want to hear. Exactly, right? So kind of just this, I keep on drilling this down to you, but there's a big difference between putting the function name without parameters, then it's a reference to the function, it's like any other variable, and then actually calling the function. But yeah, so I did it. Oh, I should increase the fonts. Oh, that's, yeah. Let's do that. And then, yeah, cool. So if I type here, you can see on the right of this console, I know it's not very big, that there's like some stuff happening. Okay, but this is pretty useless. You can investigate the type if you want. This is called the React synthetic event. Doesn't really matter for now. What I will tell you is that I just know that there is a thing called the event target. The event target is the element that the event happened on. So in this case, the event is happening on what? Like what element on the page?
The input?
The input. Beautiful. Okay. And then we want to get the value. And Lisha, this is where what you said earlier comes in. How do we get the value of an element, like the input?
I think you do dot value.
Ratatouille. Amazing. Okay, so yeah, we type in dot value, and this will give you just the value of what's inside the text box. So over here, I just do the beat pop, and if you can see, there's like this pyramid of text that's being created, and that's the stuff that I'm typing into the input box. Okay, great. That seems a little convoluted, but it'll become very natural to you in a moment. Next, we want to store this somewhere. So I actually haven't made a state for this app yet, but I'm down to do that right now. And I'm going to call this state, I don't know, current input or something. That seems fine. We need to give it a default value. Doesn't really matter what it is. And then here instead, I'm going to make this.setState. And then we'll just change current input to the event target value. So this shouldn't be too foreign to you. Just as a quick reminder, if you're watching at home and you haven't really gotten this stuff into your head yet, it's totally okay. So this.setState is how we have to change state. You can't just change the variable itself because we have to tell React, hey, we're going to change the state. Then I'm just going to change the current input. So just this one, I'm going to change the value to the value of what we just typed in, like this. Okay, and you might now say, oh, Matt, we're done, right? No. So right now, the state is the source of truth in one direction. So every time we make a change in the input, the state figures it out. But it's not the state of truth in the other direction, right? Let's say, for example, I change the default. Maybe I want to put a default parameter in here, like Peter, right? If I do that, it doesn't show up here. And we want the state to be the single source of truth. So that means in both directions. So in order to do that, I need to change the value item on input, or the value property. And so again, this is what Lisha was saying earlier. Type in value here, and here I put this.state.current input. This is now going to properly put in the default value there when we load the page. Does that make sense? Cool. So this is actually a really important concept. This has to do with I think the overall term that the React team uses is called form controlling. But it's really important to keep the state as a single source of truth, especially as your app gets more and more complicated and you have tons and tons of things on the page. If your state is in sync, it makes it really easy for you to debug your code, extend your code, and operate efficiently. And if you don't do any of those things, oftentimes you'll be very confused, you press a button, or you get inconsistency, and that's not what we want. Does that make sense? Liddy? Okay, cool. So this is great. But now we want this add the fan button to actually add something to the page. So here now we need to do two quick things. The first thing I'm going to do, so this list of people used to be a constant, right? I don't care about that anymore. So I'm going to move that instead into the app state. And it's okay for us to have a default with some stuff in it. I don't really mind. But this is important because we're going to want to change this array later, right? So if we don't put it in our state, then if we change it, the wrap doesn't know. Doesn't work properly. So again, the state is the single source of truth. Then down here, I'm just going to change this to now use the new variable name. So far, nothing should happen. Should be the exact same thing. I'm just going to remove the names of the people who aren't here. So it's going to be just me and Peter and Lisha. But cool. Okay, so this is great. So now we have to do one more thing. When we push the button, we have to add the name to the array. Technically, we all now know how to do that. But I'm going to put Peter on the spot. Peter, how are we going to do that?
I think I'm going to use an on-click handler.
Okay, solid. I like what you're saying so far.
With the the button tag.
Yeah, great. Let's do that. So let's make a submit handler. Okay, and I want to call this on the button. Sounds reasonable to me. Okay, but we're not done yet. Lisha, what do I put in the handler? I don't really know anything about React. You're going to have to tell me.
So we want the reference to the function that we want to call when the button gets clicked?
Oh, yeah. So
Oh,
that I
and
agree
inside
with.
them there.
But what would I put inside this actual submit handler function?
So I would make a new array with the new person that we're adding, and then use set state to update it.
Okay, so Alicia just made like the biggest brain move of all time. Okay, because I was trying to trap her, but she beat me. Okay, so let's quickly go over Alicia's answer and then what you might do and why that's wrong. So first, Alicia's totally correct. So what we should do is we should create a new copy of the array. So go let, and then I don't know, new copy equals this dot state dot list of people. Cool. Then we do this dot. Then we do new copy dot. Is it push or append? I always forget. Push. So how would we get the current name right now? Is there any way we could do that? Is that in our apps props maybe or somewhere else?
Is it this dot state dot current input?
Exactly. Okay, look, this is we're on fire right here. This is amazing. This is the three musketeers of awkward Zoom calls. Okay, so we're gonna push it to a new array. And then finally, as Alicia said, we're gonna set state and say, hey, let's change the list of people to the new copy. Okay, so this is gonna work as intended. So I'm gonna type in Matt, I'm gonna hit the fan, bam, Matt fan club created, we're chilling. But why did I say that Alicia was a giant brain person? Well, we all knew that. But in this particular instance, this has to do with primitive objects and knowing if something's changed or not, right? So as I mentioned in the earlier like week 2 intro JavaScript thing, there are 7 primitive types and the array is not one of them. So what that means is that I can change an array in place. So here, right, when I do new copy.push, I'm like changing new copy. New copy is changing, right? So if I don't make a copy of the array, I just change the array in place and I do set state, we're not guaranteed that React knows the variable's changed because the pointer to the array hasn't changed, right? And this sounds like it's really, really dumb, but this is how JavaScript works. And in the notes, I'm just gonna quickly bop into this section. There is a more fleshed out example. So I'll just quickly walk you through what I mean, and maybe this will make it a little clearer, right? So look at this example. We have our book collection. Maybe I'll zoom in a bit for the video. So ooh, that's a little too big. I don't like that. Too chunky. Okay, so we have our state collection, right? Book collection. So this is what we call nested state, right? Boop, boop. So there's a top level object here, but this has its own object. As soon as you have an object in an object, it's nested. Then I'm gonna tell you that this is not gonna work, right? If I do book collection dot this thing and change it, React won't necessarily update your component. And the reason why is exactly what Alicia was talking about earlier, right? Because this pointer doesn't change at all when we change its nested object. React has no idea that anything has happened. And so when you call set state, it says, oh, this is the same thing. I'm not gonna update anything, and it just calls it a day. This happens all the time. This is one of the beginner to intermediate mistakes in React. And so there are a few solutions, as you see right here. The easiest solution is to never use nested state. If you can design your app like that, that's beautiful, no problems. Turns out that's kind of hard. So there are 2 other solutions you can take. So one is you can do what we did right here, which is called deep copying the state. So in this case, it's not that deep because it's only 1 layer, but we made a copy and then we updated the copy. Then we put the new copy into the state. So this, if you do it properly, always guarantees that the state is updated. But people forget. So this is not a super great way to do it if your app's really, really complicated. Like for example, if you worked on the Facebook team. So the actual way you should do it is using an immutability helper. And if you remember what, like 5 minutes ago, I said the biggest problem here is that arrays are mutable. You can change them in place. And so when you make one, React has no idea that a change has been made. Immutable, or other libraries like it, it just makes it so that you only have immutable objects. So every time you make a new one and change them, they have a different pointer. And so there's no problem there with deep state. And then you can make your state as deep as you want. So this is a very popular solution. I'm not going to go through how to use it today. I think it's not too tricky, but just want to let you know in the back of your mind that this is a problem that you'll face when you're designing your own app. So the big gotcha here is you need to be careful with nested state. Make sense? Julio? People will sometimes say that Redux is the solution to nested state, and that's not entirely true. If we have time at the end, we'll talk about Redux, but it's not super relevant for us right now. Okay, great. So I've now created user input. The user input is controlled by the state of our app, and then we can do stuff. Okay. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, this is kind of depressing. It says I have 0 fans right now, and I don't like that. I'm a pretty narcissist kind of guy. So I want to make the fans increase, maybe every second or something, right? By a random number. And this is exactly the example that I had in the demo. Here's the problem. We need to start randomly increasing the stuff only after the component has been made, but not before. Because if it was before, it would look sketchy, and also it's inefficient code. Then we also need to stop incrementing that number once the component gets deleted. Does that make sense so far? That's the premise of the problem. So this is a more common interaction than you might think. Not all web developers are narcissists, but it turns out that there are lots of other operations that you want to do only when a component starts, and then clean it up once the component ends. So real life examples of this are things like event listeners, right? Under the hood, React needs to know when you make an input tag, you need to have an event that checks every time the input is pressed, but once it's gone, you don't need the handler anymore. Or for stuff that you would code, if you have a database, for example, once you load your page, you want to keep on listening for stuff from the database, right? Every time you get a new message, parse the message, do something with it, display it on the screen. But when the user navigates off the page, they shouldn't be opening the database connection anymore. Does that make sense so far? Great. Okay, so this is called a subscriber-unsubscriber pattern, or it has many other names. I don't really care. But it's very common. So we're going to implement that today with my dumb narcissist example. So we're going to quickly switch gears and go to fan club maker here, because we're going to edit each individual component. Okay, so we're going to use this thing called the component lifecycle. I'm going to first code it and tell you the very bare bone basics, and then we'll go back to the very complicated spooky diagram and talk about it a bit more. So one thing you might remember from CS32, I hope David Smallberg has drilled this into your brain, is that when you extend a component, you can override some of its methods, right? So all React components have a few set of methods, and React says, hey, you can change the behavior, and then we'll run them for you at the right time. So one of these elements is called component did mount. So we'll talk about the name in a moment, but for now, just this gets called after the component gets created is what you need to know, okay? So this is a prime candidate for us to put our random number generator, okay? So let's do that. I'm going to use, so the function is called setInterval. This is a JavaScript function that just runs a function in the background for a set interval. So the second thing it takes is the interval. I'm going to put down, I don't know, 1,000 milliseconds. So that's 1 second. And the first parameter I'm going to put here is a function. Okay, mes amigos. How do I pass a function to another function? Is there a convenient syntax that involves a shape that might be helpful here?
Maybe an arrow.
Amazing, Alicia. Amazing. An arrow function is exactly what we're looking for. And it turns out that we actually have to do this with an arrow function, but I'll explain why in a moment. So we're going to use an arrow function. If you don't remember from last time, it's totally okay. It's an anonymous function, so this means no parameters, arrow. This is the function body. Then in here, I just want to increment the number of fans I have. How could I do that?
Is there some sort of like math.random that you could think through?
Oh, for now, let's just say I'm going to add 1. We'll solve the problem later. There is a math.random. Yeah. So how would we do that, Peter? How would we add 1 to the state?
Is it going to be like? Sorry, I actually don't know.
That's okay. So we'll use this .set state again. In this case, because numbers are primitive type, it's okay for us to do this pattern, which is only fans equals only fans plus 1. And I can't do that. I have to do this state. This is not the best way to do it. We'll come back to this in a moment, but this is going to work. Does this logic make sense? So set interval says every 1 second, we're going to call this anonymous function. And this anonymous function says, hey, we're going to set the state and add 1. Okay, so let's check it out. Great. Yeah, look at that. It's working. The number is going up by 1 every single time, right? So this seems kind of sus. Like if I saw this on a website, I'd feel like, oh, this is totally faked. So maybe not super great. But as Peter mentioned, there's a math.random. So let's do that. So I'm going to do let rand equals math. This part is not super important. You can always just Google how math.random works. But just to let you know, it returns a number between 0 and 1. And it's a half open set. So it includes 0, but it doesn't include 1. So if you want to do a number between 0 and anything, like 90, for example, or 100, you just multiply the result of math.random by that number. So in this case, I feel like it would be realistic to have 10, maybe, or 20. Why not? And then here I'll just do plus rand. So if we do this, oh no. Oh yeah, and now it's a decimal. I'm going to use the math.floor function that gives us an integer. But keep in mind that JavaScript doesn't actually have integers, which is dumb. Okay, so there we go. Now, Alicia, oh, okay, Peter is slowly winning, but Alicia's coming up close. Dude, Peter's getting really lucky right here with the random rolls. Oh, okay, now Alicia's taking the lead. Okay, we could watch these numbers go up all day, but I want to quickly talk about the arrow function here and how this ties back to our previous lessons on this. So if this was a function, this actually wouldn't work. And the reason why is because this tends to point to the thing that called the function. So if I made this thing a function instead, I just wrote the word function, this would probably point to set interval, which is not what we want, because we want this to point to fan club maker. Does that make sense so far? However, as we discussed, arrow functions don't have a calling scope. Technically, they don't have like a lexical scope that causes a closure or something, but not super important. What this really means is that this arrow function is going to have the same this value as the set interval function. And the set interval function's this value is componented mount. Does that solve our problem? Maybe. But componented mount is an arrow function. Oh, beautiful. And in reality, there's actually some overloaded syntax. You don't have to do this anymore. I think it's a good idea to still do it. It's good practice. But overall, this is where arrow functions are really important. So you should always use arrow functions unless you know you shouldn't, basically, is the gist of what I'm saying. So it's very important for us to use arrow functions here. Okay, great. We're cool. One thing I'll say is that this count doesn't stop once we leave the page. Technically, in our case, this is fine because the only way you can leave this page is closing it. But if you had a multi-page app or you had animations or something, like then that's not good. So very quickly, how would we close this page? So there's another one called component will unmount. And notice it's the exact opposite of component did mount. Did, will, mount, unmount. And this gets called right before the component gets deleted from the tree. You don't know this, but set interval actually returns a function. And the function it returns is the cleanup function that says stop the interval. I'm just going to do this dot stopper equals that. And then I'm going to do this dot stopper. Cool, cool, cool. So this doesn't do anything, but I'm just going to tell you that it works. And this is very important to do, especially if you have database transactions. But I'm going to ask now a skill testing question right here. OK? Why isn't this thing state or props? Or am I wrong? Should I have made it state or props?
Well, it's definitely not state because state is only storing like the number of OnlyFans, and props is not what we want either. But like, is it because of our arrow functions?
I like where your head is at. Arrow functions are good, but you actually already got it right in the first portion. You can use a process of elimination, right? This function, the definition or what it does is not relevant to how our app looks. It doesn't change the rendering at all. And in fact, we're going to find out this in just a moment. This only gets called after the props and state are about to be destroyed. So in the grand scheme of things, this value and this value being changed doesn't affect our app's state. So there's no reason to make it state or props. But yeah, does that make sense so far? This one's a little confusing. Basically what I'm saying is you can use things that aren't state or props if you don't need them to render your app. Cool. Okay, I'm going to quickly bring up the spooky chart. So I want to talk a little bit about the formality of what we just mentioned, which is the component lifecycle. And Alicia, I think you've already seen this, so I apologize in advance. So this is the chart, very spooky, lots of words. I'm just going to verbally explain the spook, and hopefully it's not too bad. So as you might remember, there are some actions that a component has. So we did component did mount and component will unmount. So mount means they're going to put it on the page in the DOM. Okay, and the names are pretty helpful here. So component did mount means the component's already been mounted. So it's been put on the page, and then we're going to do something. Similarly, component will unmount means it's about to be removed from the page. So let's do some cleanup actions and finish things up. Cool. There's also another type of action called updating. So updating happens when one of three, but really two important things happen. Either if the props change or the state changed, right? And this is why I said earlier, your state and by extension, your props need to be the source of truth for your app. Everything you need to render your page needs to come from the state or the props, okay? So every time an update happens, it figures out the props in the state, and then it renders the information. And this is the guarantee that React gives you. So every single time the data changes, you'll always get a new page refresh. That's what makes this state of truth thing so powerful. Does that make sense? We're chilling? Okay, cool. So the end components that you get are component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount. There also are some other ones like should component update get, but we're not going to talk about that for now because probably not going to be very relevant for your learning lab, but they're there. You should learn about them if you really like React. So component did update is exactly what you think it does. It gets called when the component finishes updating. This one is not as useful, but it's still useful every now and then. If you just want to make a counter of how many times your page updates, that's great too. But also, if you triggered a refresh and you need to create an animation, for example, right? Every time the page loads or refreshes, you want to trigger something, right? Or alternatively, you can check, oh, an update has happened. Now I'm going to check, hey, has the state become this variable? If it's become this variable, I need to do something else, right? That's another use case where this is important. These three things are called lifecycle functions, and deep down, they're overrides of these class behaviors, and they're going to be called, and React will guarantee that they'll be called. Sound coolio? That's most of what we need to know about lifecycle. I wrote a bit more here. I misspelled random. Wow, that's so sad. I wrote a bit more here. If you want, you can read more, but you don't really have to. This is, I think, enough of a working knowledge for most of what you need for your app. Okay. We're doing pretty well in terms of OnlyFans, right? Like this is, I think, possibly better than this OnlyFans so far. Because now you can add people and, you know, you can say that you're a fan and stuff like that. Okay, there are a few other things I'm going to talk about. One thing is I said here, there's actually a better way to write this. This is, I don't know if Alicia's taken 111. I don't know if Peter, you've heard about the term race condition before. But I'm going to quickly explain what I mean. So give me 1 sec. I'm just going to see if I can pull up an example and make both of our lives easier. Cool. So I have a very Kevin-inspired example here. So we have our OWOs and our UWOs, right? So this is what we call an asynchronous function. So this means, in layman's terms, that once you call the function, it'll do something in the background. And you're not guaranteed that the thing in the background will happen like instantaneously. It might take, you know, a few milliseconds or a few seconds. This is how a lot of things work with computers. So this is not a super new concept, but you don't really learn this concept in intro CS classes, but I want to bring it up now. Why is this relevant? So let's look at this example. If I console log some message and I get OWO, right? Then I change it to UWO. I can't believe I'm saying OWO and UWO in a video. And then I immediately after log the value of the message, it could be OWO and it could be UWO, right? So how could it be OWO? The set state was dispatched, but it's like still doing its stuff and it hasn't changed yet, right? It also could be UWO because the change happened. Eventually, we're guaranteed that the state update will complete. And usually this is on the order of milliseconds, but this thing is still a problem. So how could this thing be a problem in our code? This is a good example right here that I wrote. So, and this has to do with the race condition. If you've heard of race conditions before, this is going to make a lot of sense. I'm going to walk everyone through it anyways. So in this case, let's just say we have a counter and for some reason we want to check if two conditions have happened. So this is how you would often do it, right? And notice that you can't use else if because if these two both happen, you want to, add 2. Does that make sense? So if something happens, we like add 1 to a counter. If something else happens, we also add 1 to a counter. So this is a little tricky, but there's actually a race condition here. So here's what happens with the race condition. So first, let's say something and something else are true. So we're going to run both of these statements. So first, this happens. Cool? Make sense so far? Next, this thing happens. This function uses this.state.counter. As we just established before, this may or may not be the correct value we want it to be. It might be the value here, or it might be the value here plus 1. Does that make sense so far? The problem comes if this value gets triggered before this set state happens, because then we're going to add 1, and now we just have 2 set state requests that do the same thing, which is increment that one number by 1. The end result means that your code is wrong, because you were supposed to increment the number by 2, but it only increments by 1. Does this make sense? This is kind of a tricky concept. Yes, Alicia, cool? Alicia's a 111, got no problems. Okay, great. So this is a race condition, and it's bad. Sometimes there is no way to solve this problem, and you have to use complex things like mutexes or whatever, but we don't have to deal with that. If we're dealing with numbers or other operations on the previous state, so if you're incrementing something, you're adding 1, you're just removing one thing from the previous state, React has actually built in a solution for us. And this has to do with the this.setState function. And here I'm going to just switch back to the code here so we can do it live. So if you notice, right, this.setState function only depends on the previous state in rand. Are we correct there? We don't depend on anything else. Okay. So rand, we're going to calculate every time, so it's no problem. So now this function only depends on the previous state. Well, it turns out React actually gives us another thing we can pass to this.setState. We can pass in a function. What kind of function do you think this function might be?
Anonymous?
Yeah, an arrow function. So the arrow function takes in one argument, which is the previous state. And you can call this whatever you want, but I just tend to call it prev state. But you can name it whatever you want. And then this function just needs to return an object that you want to update it to, right? So whatever this thing returns should be the same thing as you would normally put in this.setState. Does that make sense? But here's the genius. So now here we can just say onlyfans is equal to previous state dot onlyfans plus rand. And the critical thing here is now we are, oh, sorry, there should be 2 braces here. My bad. And maybe do I need to return? Okay. Some line shenanigans. But the critical thing here is now I'm no longer doing this.state.onlyfans, right? And in our case, it's not a huge problem because we know this is going to run every second, but I'm sure you can imagine if it ran every millisecond or something that we would have a problem. This fixes that problem because now this always guarantees that we get the previous state and we update it like that. Okay. Again, is this a problem that's going to affect us that much? Probably not. But just to tell you, like I had to deal with this problem. So when I worked at Booz Allen Hamilton last year, I had to do a lot of stuff. But one of the things I had to make was a React dashboard, and it would receive something on the order of 10,000 messages a second. Okay. And I had to update some dashboard graph view and something with all this new information that we were getting. And some of it was running averages. So I had to add stuff and multiply stuff that was based on the previous data. And I forgot to use previous state. And when I demoed it, there were just like a bunch of errors and it was getting the wrong readings all the time. And my boss was like, wow, you suck at your job. Okay, they didn't actually say that. They were very nice people. But as you can imagine, that's a problem, right? And especially if you use React in high load scenarios, or if you work an intern at a big company that uses React to process lots of data, this starts becoming a really big problem. So even though in our case, it doesn't really matter, I think you should still always use this pattern when relevant because it's good practice and it'll kind of ingrain into your head that this is the right way to do it. Sound good? So every time your state depends on the previous state, you should always use this previous state callback function. The only time you shouldn't use it is if the previous state doesn't depend on if the state doesn't depend on the previous state. Like, you know, in our input example, we don't care what the user had typed previously. We just care about what's in the box right now. Make sense? Liddy? Okay, great. Wow, I've been talking for a very long time, and I apologize. And I know this is not the sexiest stuff to talk about, but I'm pretty sure we have covered either in this or in the previous lesson most of the stuff that is in this giant amorphous blob of stuff. Oh, I should talk about, yeah, okay, I'll talk about one more thing, which is passing functions as props. This is not really tricky, and I think Peter and Alicia have already killed the game in terms of their understanding of event handlers. But the idea is just like, what if you want to change the parent from the child, right? So in this case, the easiest one is, let's say we want to delete a fan club, right? The button to delete the fan club should probably be in the fan club component. Can we agree with that? Makes sense, right? Let me just add a button right here. So I want to be able to click the delete club button and it'll delete the fan. But the problem, right, is that the list of the fan clubs that exist are up here. They're in our app. They're not in our fan club maker. So there's no way for us to delete it there. Luckily for us, there is a pattern we can use. And this pattern involves passing down a function from the parent to the child. And that function deals with the state. Might have been a bit confusing, so I'm just going to code it with all of you right here. So I'm going to make a function here in the app called delete club or delete person. Honestly, this is a really poorly designed app, so I apologize for that, or at least named app. And in this case, I'm going to update the state again, but I want to remove an element of an array. There are a lot of different ways you can remove an element of an array. If you just Google it, I'm sure there's like lots of things that you can find, but we're going to use array.splice. Long story short, splice. We'll walk through the example. So we'll do what Alicia said earlier. We're going to make a copy of the array. Great. And then we're going to splice this, and we're going to just change it in place. So we're going to do new copy.splice. The first thing you put in here is the index of the element you want to change. So we actually need to take in, right, like which person are we going to delete? So we'll have that. So we put an index here. And then the next thing you want to put in here is how many elements we're going to replace it with. This is a little mentally tricky, I think, to think about. But basically, oh, shoot. Could we just have used, was there a much easier? Nah, don't worry about it. We're just going to do one here. And that just means we're going to replace the thing. Great. So, oh, I pressed that button. So this is going to delete the thing from the array. If it doesn't work, we'll go on Stack Overflow. But I believe in myself. I don't know if you all believe in me. The next thing we're going to do is we're just going to add a prop here that figures out how to do this, right? So we are going to, first I'm just going to tell you one other thing about the map function. Sorry, this is a bit disorganized. So the map function, it actually calls the function with like 3 parameters. A fun fact about JavaScript is that JavaScript doesn't care how many parameters you give a function or arguments you give a function. If it's like less than normal, the rest will be undefined. And if it's more than normal, it'll just like forget about the rest of them. It's a very strange thing, but in this case, it's very useful because it turns out that the second thing you get is the index. So the index is just the number it is in the array. So here, I'm going to create a prop called like delete func or something. And I'm going to create an arrow function here. And then this arrow function is going to call our this.delete person with the index. So one thing I want to point out here before we actually implement this is that we couldn't just do what we did here and pass in the function pointer. Why not? Why couldn't we just have written inside delete func this.delete person? Any thoughts?
Is it because we need the index?
Yes, exactly. Alicia, you're killing the game. Merge the PR, answering these questions. Amazing stuff. So if we just put this dot delete person, it would definitely pass down the function pointer, but there's no way for us to say which number to delete. And we could write like a this dot delete person 0, this dot delete person 1, this dot delete person 2. That's kind of dumb. So this is probably the best way we want to do it. As a quick fun fact, this is a feature called a closure in JavaScript. This is probably the most confusing medium to advanced area of JavaScript. It's very cool. We're not going to talk about it because it's way too confusing. But the long story short is, how do we know what index is when we call this function? Don't worry about it though, just pretend it works for now. But look it up if you're interested. Closures, very cool. Also, as another fun fact, not to roast Eggert here, but Eggert doesn't know how closures work because we talked about it for a bit. It's very fun. So you can just flex on him. If you know how closures work, you know more about JavaScript than Eggert. Eggert, don't kill me. I still like you. Okay, so we passed down this prop. Very cool. Now what we want to do is call this, right? So this is very similar to what we did before. We just do on click. And then in here, we put this dot delete handler or delete function. Sorry, do this dot props. My bad. So other than this one strange thing with the arrow function and putting the parameter there, this is like passing down any other prop, right? And that's how functions work in JavaScript. They're just objects. You play with them like anything else. So now if we do this, we can delete P. Oh. Ah. Great. We're getting roasted on this. This is what I like to see. Okay. So this is great. Okay, let's first uncomment this. I just want to prove that this works, and then we'll figure this out. So if I delete the club, right, Peter's gone. Rest in peace, Peter's club. It had 33 fans. So that's working properly. So this is working quite well because this actually demonstrates a feature of the lifecycle that I wasn't going to talk about, but I guess we are now. So basically, the problem is that when unmount gets called, it actually deletes quite a few portions of things. But basically, the short story, though, is that I'm just not using this properly. So what I should actually have done is this. We'll leave the long story till later. So if I do this now, I delete the club, things work properly. And if you notice, and I add Leisha again, for example, right? It starts at 0 again. That's like the important thing. So ignoring my dumbness with the clear interval, I should update the README. Did this concept make sense? So we want to change the parent from the child. And in order to do that, we passed a function from the parent to the child. And the child calls the function. It's a little bit confusing too, but hopefully with some practice, this design pattern makes a lot of sense. And this works out really well. Okay, cool. I believe we have now covered everything in this doc, which is kind of nuts because this is 4,000 words and we spent 50 minutes on it. So I'm pretty glad. Or if you're watching at home on 2x speed, you spent 25 minutes on it. There are a few other things that are more specific that I talk about in the README. If you want, you can read through it. There's no pressure. Everything we covered verbally here is more than enough to make your own OnlyFans website. Just two last very brief topics I'll talk about, and then we'll try to end early. So one is Redux. What is Redux and why do people use it? So basically, let's say you have like a really complicated app, right? And there's like 20 components that all like make each other. If you want to pass something from the parent to the child, you have to pass it down 20 times. And that seems dumb, right? It's not a huge problem, but it's kind of frustrating. So what Redux does is it provides you like a centralized place that every component can get to. And that centralized place actually manages the state. So no longer do we have this pattern where the parent app manages everything. Rather, there's just some like random thing, and that thing manages the entire app state, and everything else just interacts with that thing. Does that make sense as a concept? And this has to do with Redux containers and state managers, actions, reducers, blah, blah, blah. Has to do with functional programming. Very cool. But I will say at the same time, you can probably design your app without Redux and it's not going to be a problem. If people work in places like Facebook and you're making the Facebook front page, you're going to use Redux or something like that. So it's very popular. If you want to, you can check it out, but you won't need it for your learning lab. We do use it at TeachLA for our editor because we have that problem. We pass down a bunch of stuff to a bunch of different components and we want to make it more convenient. Okay, great. The other thing I want to talk about very quickly then, since we just have a smidgen of time, is React hooks. So far, in order to make an app have state, we had to make it a class, right? Because we couldn't, make a function that has state, because that's not how functions work. And classes are directly antithetical, are the antithesis, are orthogonal? I don't know. There's some fancy word you put there, to functional programming. Because the premise of classes is that they keep their own state, and you change stuff about the class, and on and on. So hooks are another way to introduce state in your components. And they released it about 6 months to a year ago. I think I still remember when hooks came out, and I was pretty excited. And it works. It's like a fully out of beta feature, but they're kind of complicated. So we didn't explain them in this go, because most people watching this video have previous experience with C++, so they've done all the object-oriented stuff. But I encourage you to look at hooks in your own time if React is something that interests you. Obviously, if you hate React, don't look at this. But this is a very elegant way to write state-related things. And in fact, it has general performance benefits over this.setState. Over time, I believe that we're just going to phase out class-based components, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. So if React's something you care a lot about, I would definitely look into hooks. Super, super useful, and sometimes helps you write really elegant code with respect to state. So it's just something cool. There's a guide in the README. I linked a bunch of different things. This is all the reference material that I pulled this lesson from, including the hook stuff. You can read it if you're interested. If you're not, it's totally fine. As parting notes, I'll just say React has a really good tutorial, in my opinion. Obviously, we can defer. But they have this one called Main Concepts that explains basically all the concepts that we talked about with more in-depth stuff. So if you're bored and you want to read something, that's a great option. They also have a tutorial where you make tic-tac-toe, I think, unless they've changed it. And, oh, is it now a shopping list? Okay. Oh, no, it is tic-tac-toe. Great. And it goes through all these different design patterns that I talked about in one coherent project. So if you watch this video and we're like, wow, Matt is garbage at teaching React, I would prefer something else. Peter's like nodding. He's like, yes. This is a good resource. I would definitely check this out. The last thing I'll say is React is much more complicated than what we just mentioned today. And I think this is probably going to be our last React lesson. I know there's one booked on Monday, but I might change that to something else. So if it's something that you care a lot about and you realize that web development is your passion, I definitely encourage you to learn more about React and more about its complicated use cases. Because if you get really good at React, not only do you get to make lots of money, but you also get to make really, really cool web applications. And I think React, honestly, has changed a lot about how web apps work and how people write them and make maintainable code. Okay, that's the end of my blurb. We're going to end early by 3 minutes, which is beautiful. Any last questions, Peter or Alicia, about React? We're chilling? Okay, well, thank you for watching our YouTube video. Please like and subscribe. Give us feedback. If you're part of the Learning Lab squad, work on your designs. Look at the Figma stuff. It's very cool. Big thanks to Tomoki for doing that. And also, Karen is doing the accessibility workshop. Please fill out the when to meet so we can schedule that, because we want to make sure that all of our learning labs are really inclusive and work for colorblind people, for blind people, for people with other kinds of visual impairments, or epilepsy or things like that. So please, if you can, fill out that when to meet, work on your design, and I will see y'all soon. But that's it for this video. Thank you for watching.